Speaking about no self today. So, what is no self? No self is something you hear in Buddhism, in meditation. So, what is no self? And can there be no self? So, to start this exploration, we go to Buddhism, which is my first point of reference with regard to no self. There's an analogy where someone comes to the Buddha and he asks him, what happens to an arahant? An arahant is an enlightened being after death. And the Buddha says this is not the right question. And so the Buddha gives him this answer. He goes, where can you find the self right now? There was the belief in something called the Atma, or the soul, and this is Atta in Pali, the Buddhist language, or the language that the Buddhist scriptures are written in. So the way they tried to answer the question of self was they would say this being is composed of 5 aggregates. So these 5 components stick together to form the self. So the first aggregate is form, the second is feeling, the third is perception, the fourth is mental formations, which is, your behaviors, your psyche, things like that, what makes up your personality. And the fifth is consciousness. Consciousness here is a very wide topic, but in the Buddhist sense, it has 2 meanings. So the first is you can have consciousness within a sense faculty. So you can have consciousness of sight, of smell, of taste. Something becomes conscious, and that's what they refer to. And then the other thing that is referred to as consciousness is something greater, where all experiences land on. It's like a meta structure that all experiences land on, and it accepts them. So the Buddha goes to the list and he asks the person, he goes, is this form you? And a follow-up question is, if this form is you, if you are this form, then surely you could control it. But can you control your body? Can you stop it from aging? Can you stop it from getting sick? Can you stop it from dying? And medical science has gone a long way in increasing lifespans, but we haven't managed to stop death at will. You can bring a person into like a suspended animation indefinitely on life support, but you can't stop death. So the answer is no form. You can't control form. So how could form be self? So how could this body be self? And going through the list of the 5, the same thing. Can you stop feeling? Can you control feeling? Do you have any control? Like when you feel bad about something, you feel bad about it. You could reframe it. You could do what you want. Same thing with perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. When your eye consciousness lands on something, how much control do you have over all this? So how can you say that this is me? Because if it was you, then you would have agency. And the amount of agency we have is limited. Right? You can control things to a certain extent, but you don't have full agency over it. The organism does what it does. And so the overreaching question in all this is, then we all feel the sense of me or I am, right? There is a sense of me and I am, yes, all these, which persists, the I am that was there when I was 5 years old is the same I am that I have now at this age, as with everyone listening. And is that a soul? So the Buddha's answer to that question, so the Buddha always declined to answer questions with regard to self. He didn't categorically agree or deny that there was a self. So his answer was, if a fire was lit in one place and it went out, and then a fire was lit in another place, is that the same fire? It's very enigmatic. It's really something to think about. And I don't know the answer. I can't give you a definitive answer. I have some idea of what I think, but it's just my conjecture. So there is a persistent sense of me, and another explanation from Buddhism is that we're all born with something called the sankharas. So sankhara is a program. So the word sankhara comes from the word kar. And the word kar means to do, right? Is about action. So we have these programs. So when you're born, there is the body sankhara. So there's a program of the body. So when a child is born, its bones are soft. As it gets older, the bones harden. Temporary teeth fall out, permanent teeth grows. The body gets taller, it gets stronger. Then eventually it gets old, it gets sick, and it dies. And the same with the psyche. The psyche is born with the I am program, which has its benefits. It keeps you alive, it keeps you protected, in situations. But it can also become very narrow. It can become very narrow, and that's where the ego comes in. That's where people talk about the ego, and they say, the ego isn't a good thing. Well, it's subjective. The ego is something that we were born with and something we were given from birth. And the trick in all this is not to take the ego too seriously. Like Ram Dass used to say that at this stage in my life, I treat Ram Dass, the ego, Ram Dass, the person, like a pet. It has tantrums, it has a particular personality, and it is as it is. So no one's asking you to eliminate the self. You don't annihilate the self. You recognize the self as a pattern that arises and ceases. And that's what we do in meditation. Is when something comes up in the personality, so the personality experiences something unpleasant or painful, and the personality is experiencing that based on all the programs. But at that moment an I am is born, conditions for that ill feeling come about. There's the programs of the personality, those things come together, and the self is born. So these selves are born and they die constantly. So an angry self or a sad self is born, conditions change, and another self is born. And these selves keep on persisting. And of course, there is that sense of I am. And within the Buddhist philosophy, there is also something called the citta. Now, citta is something that refers to the heart mind. So you have the intellectual mind, which is the mano, and you have the citta. And this citta, they say in Buddhism, is the receptor of all the karma and all the impressions. And this citta is linked to rebirth. But citta is also a program. So you could say, well, if there isn't any self, then who gets reborn, right? And this comes back to the Buddha's analogy on fire. If a fire is lit in one place, is it the same as a fire that's lit in another place. So if a fire is lit in one place, it's extinguished, and then it comes about in another place, is it the same fire? So the teaching on non-self is something that we use to disidentify from taking things too personally. When things occur, a condition arises, it interacts with the sankhara or the patterns that we have, and a person is born. And when those conditions cease, then that person is born. So there isn't a permanent self that's feeling bad. Its selves are arising and ceasing. So the teaching on non-self, in my opinion, is something that's asking us not to hold on to those things, not to take things so personally as we do. We all do. And of course, in Buddhism, they say that when the being reaches nirvana or enlightenment, then the sense of I am falls away. And the sense of I am is important. If you didn't have a sense of I am, you'd become psychotic or be defined as psychotic. Like there's some people who have multiple senses of I am, and there's different I ams coming up, and there's an I am that's telling them to go and commit violent acts and things like that, and there's an I am which is a benefactor, and that's illness. So that's what the teaching on no self or anatta is pointing us to, just to not take things so personally.